was a great pleasure. I know you're a very busy man. For those who don't know, Jonathan is Professor and Al-Walid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in the States. He's author of a number of works and papers and articles and so on, and not least this one, Slavery and Islam. There we are, very simple, striking cover there, as well as my personal favorite work of yours, Misquoting Muhammad, and there's also an amazing book, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. That's not even mentioning your PhD thesis, which is on Bukhari and Muslim, which is also worth looking at as well. But today you've kindly agreed to discuss this critically acclaimed book, Slavery and Islam, which I highly recommend. I've certainly read it. And I think just to cut to the chase, really, because it's one of those fundamental issues that you really deconstruct in the book so effectively. What is slavery and the problem of defining it today? Because this actually, when you look beneath the surface of the rhetoric, is actually a really complicated question and is not as simple and essentialist as we might think, surprisingly.
We're assuming that there's actually something called slavery that exists throughout time and space. Like, it's just a historical continuity.
It's a trans-historical, transcendent category that just fits a whole bunch of relationships, clearly defined. That's slavery.
Yeah. And so what our task is to just come up with the definition of that, right? So then we know what it is, and we'll go and we'll find it in ancient China, or we'll find it in ancient Egypt, or whatever, right?
And that's the common sense position today. Have you talked about on the street? Yeah, but slavery is slavery. What's the problem? But what you've done is you've uncovered is absolutely not the case.
Well, there's two schools of thought in global slavery studies. So one, the minority school, which you can see why it's a minority because it's kind of self-eliminating, right? Which is that there's not such a thing as some essential slavery throughout space and time, right? That actually, if you go and you study a society in kind of what's today the country of Congo in Central Africa, and you look at the relationships of dependence and control and power and things like that, it's so shaped by its own context and its own society that it's really not productive to go and say that this is the same thing as what's happening in India in 1700 or in America in 1900 or 1800 or something like that, right? So there's what's the name of the person who advocated this most? Now, of course, I'm forgetting this because it's been so many years since I wrote this book. But one person is Igor Kopytov. He's a person who's a kind of anthropologist who wrote about this. So there's one school of thought which basically says that, like, let's look at specific societies, specific traditions. Let's study those on their own and not worry about defining or discussing some global phenomenon called slavery. Yeah. The majority position is that there is such a thing that you can identify throughout history as slavery, and you can talk about it in the U.S., you can talk about it in Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera. Then the question is, how do you define it? Right. So there's sort of and it's interesting. It's actually really interesting because you see the circularity here, and I'm not trying to sort of dump on this field or really kind of dismiss it. I think it's very interesting. You learn a lot. It's very productive, but you see a circularity. And I think it's important, like going on behind this study, which is, and one great scholar once talked about this one scholar of slavery and world history said that the more we learn about slavery, the harder it is to define. I want you to think about that because it's very interesting. The more we learn about slavery, the harder it is to define.
No, I agree. I agree. I mean, Karl Marx criticized wage slavery in Victorian England.
No, but here, this problem is even more serious than that, right? Which is,
if you want legal slaves,
you don't know what it is. If you haven't defined what you're looking at, you don't know what you're looking at. So if I say, like, I'm going to go and study all the dogs in my neighborhood, right? So I know what a dog is. I go and I look and I find everything that's a dog, and then I do a study on these things. And I don't study squirrels. I don't study cats, right? So if I study all the dogs, I can learn about the dogs in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
But if the problem is, he says, the more we learn about slavery, the harder it is to define. We actually don't have a definition. We have a developing, ongoing definition of the thing that we're studying. So then how do we know what we should be studying to learn about that definition, right? So if you're building a definition from your study of something, on what basis have you collected these things to study in the beginning? And this is so very interesting because some nominalists like Ibn Taymiyyah and also people like I think what's his name, Lorenzo Valla. I think even in the kind of 15th century in the U.S. in Europe, in Italy, they had the same critique of kind of Aristotelian logic, because Aristotelian logic starts with definition, right? So you have to arrive at a definition of a thing. Right. And that you sort of take the class it's in, and you figure out what makes it different from the other things in that class, and that defines that thing. And then you can put that in propositions, you can put that in syllogisms, you can engage in reasoning and things like that, right? What these people like Ibn Taymiyyah say is, they say, wait a second, so how do you know what it is? Like, the definition doesn't teach you anything. So if I say I want to define dogs, I say, okay, I just think of the things that are dogs, and I try and figure out what's a common characteristic about them. So I say, okay, they have 4 legs, they're mammals, they're furry, they have canines, they walk on their flat feet.
Yeah.
And then I say, okay, but that also includes cats. So what am I going to do to exclude cats? And then I come up with the definition, and I say, oh wait, but that excludes like chihuahuas, because they may, so I have to expand it to include chihuahuas, right? Actually, what I'm doing is I already know what dogs are, and I'm just coming to come up with the definition for what's in my mind, the category of dog. So I actually already know what it is I'm looking for, and what I'm doing is just formalizing that. I'm not actually discovering the essence of something. So I already know what a dog is. So if we go throughout history looking for slavery so that we can figure out how do we come up with a good global definition for slavery, what we're going and doing is finding things that look like slavery to us, excluding things that don't look like slavery to us, and then coming up with a definition for that.
Yeah.
You can see what it really is it's, and I don't mean this to kind of cast aspersions on people or say they have bad intentions, right? But what you're talking about is people who come from essentially modern Western background, modern Western perspective on history, and they're going and looking kind of throughout history and space and time and finding things that look like slavery to them and making it part of the definition, excluding things that aren't. And that's it's biased. First of all, everything is biased, right? But it's also politically loaded, because then you get to define what's slavery and therefore evil, and what's not slavery and therefore not evil, right? Okay. So I think this is really important.